You know what? I think as people, as human beings, we've got to learn how to slow down in life before it kills us. I mean, we live life at such a frantic pace today. It just seems like it gets faster and faster and faster. A few years ago, an economist named for Americans have increased to an all-time high. She says that a full-time employee today works an average of 212 more hours per week than people did in 1969. That's like 5 extra weeks of work per year. I was talking to one of our elders, Glenn, just last week, and he told me that week he had worked almost 40 hours of overtime. That's like 80 hours in 1 week. In 2019, a survey said that 74% of Americans, they're always rushed. They're always behind and trying to get ahead, even during time off. Even when we're taking time off, it seems like that can, there's so many things that we want to do, so many engaging activities, and we end up just being exhausted because there are so many choices today. There's more TV channels to watch than ever. When I was growing up, there were 3. Who remembers that? Three channel. Yeah, it's not like now there are hundreds and hundreds. There's more amusement parks to go and visit. There's more movies to rent or to go to, more magazines to read, more networks to explore online, things that we're interested in, and more pressure. I mean, how many of us would admit that after a long weekend, after camping or going somewhere, or a weekend at the beach or Busch Gardens or Colonial Williamsburg, that when we get home, we feel like we need a few days off from our days off, just to try to relax a little bit and catch up. Somehow we have got to learn to slow down, because that is stress. It creates stress, and all of that stress is leading to a cause of a lot of health problems for a lot of people. The New England Journal of Medicine says that living under constant stress and pressure increases blood pressure and significantly increases the risk of coronary heart disease. Chronic stress also impairs our memory, accelerates to find some quiet time, or it's literally going to kill us. You know it. I know it. And God certainly knows it. Welcome, everybody. So glad that you made the decision to join us today. If you're visiting, we're so grateful to have you here. We're actually in a series of messages talking about the 10 Commandments. And today we're going to talk about the 4th commandment, God's command to keep the Sabbath. And here's what I think. I think some of you guys are going to love this message, and I think some of you are going to hate it. And I just know that coming out of the gate. Some of you guys, you're going to really like it, and you're going to get a lot of things out of it. And some of you will probably hate it, and that's okay. What we're finding out, last week, a lot of people came up to me, and they said, the 3rd commandment, man, and look to see what it actually means. And I think today's message is going to be like that too. Hopefully, whether you love it or hate it, you'll be curious enough to actually open up your Bible and begin to study it and do the research on your own. But let's begin with just some observations that I have about the 4th commandment. I can tell you this, because this is true. This is the longest of the 10 commandments in the number of words that is used to describe it and present it to us. The number of words used to communicate it, there are more words in the 4th commandment than any of them. It's also one of the most difficult. Some commandments are really, really easy. Don't murder. Don't steal. Don't lie. We get those. But this one, it uses a lot of words to communicate it because it's difficult to get the point across, and it's hard to interpret. And because of that, the 4th commandment remains a debate. It's open to debate and speculation, because there's actually some biblical differences in the way that it's presented. Now, the truth is, some of us might actually feel guilty about this particular commandment because of the way that we spend our Sundays, the way that we choose to spend our Sundays. We read these words, remember the Sabbath, and that we're actually supposed to remember. I mean, this is in the Old Testament. What are we supposed to remember? Or exactly how do you keep a day holy? How do you make one day holy from the rest? And that makes us feel, it makes us feel a little uneasy. Are we doing it right? What if we do it wrong? What are the consequences? In my opinion, this commandment is by far the most controversial among Christians. Not necessarily Jews. They follow the law. They still try to follow the law. But many Christians can pretty much agree on all of the other commandments. But this one, it's kind of open to interpretation. It really is, and I'll show you why. Some Christians worship on Saturdays. I know some Christians who worship on Saturdays. The official Hebrew Sabbath day is Saturday, but most Christians worship on Sundays, don't we? That's what you grew up doing. It's what a lot of Christians do. We worship on Sunday, the day that Christ rose in the resurrection. And then some Christians actually worship on alternate days and times of the week. Friday nights, for example, or even Saturday nights in many big churches. We did that at our last church. When I would preach a message there, I would deliver that message on Thursday, sometimes on Friday, multiple times on Sunday, sometimes on Saturday. I mean, we did it because the church wasn't big enough to accommodate everybody, and we wanted some flexibility. The people there, they came on Thursday or Friday or Saturday, not because it was necessarily the Sabbath day. A lot of them did it because their work schedule was different from other people. And there was crowding on certain days, and so people would come at different days to hear the exact same message. In the past, here in America, I know for a long time, and I know this because I ministered in Irwin, Tennessee, which is a very small community, but they had these laws, and some of them were still in effect. There were stores that were closed. Most stores for a long time would close on Sundays. Businesses would close on Sunday. And in fact, in some places, there are still civil ordinances of things you can do on Sunday and things you can't do on Sundays. Grocery stores and department stores, hardware stores, they were all closed in a lot of places on Sunday. If you needed it on Sunday, you probably had to wait till Monday because they just weren't open. I remember when I became a pastor and living in Irwin, people warned me not to get caught mowing my lawn on Sunday. They said, don't you be mowing your lawn, Pastor, because the elders of our church and people in the community, they frowned on doing any kind of manual labor on Sundays. No work on Sundays. That's the holy day. And to which I replied, I work every Sunday. I mean, Sunday's my main work day of the entire week as a minister. And look, you might not think what I do is much work. I mean, to you, I'd get up here and talk. How much work is that, Robert? Come on. Well, give it a try week after week after week and see how hard it is. But as a result of all of that different stuff and all those situations, like I said, many people approach this fourth commandment with a mixture of trepidation, unease. I mean, I can pretty much figure out the other ones, but what about this one? The sense that somehow Sunday ought to be different than all of the other days of the week, but how and why? What applies to us? What does not apply to us? And who sets the rules? What is actually scriptural and what is man-made traditions? Because we have to be careful and distinguish between the two, don't we? There's a big difference between what is actual biblical and what is tradition. I once saw a newspaper cartoon that kind of illustrates the tension of this, and I looked for it, but I couldn't find it. But there's a guy, and he's gone fishing. He's going to go fishing, and it's Sunday, and he goes out, and he comes up empty. He doesn't catch a single thing. On the way back home, though, he stops by a little store market there, and he buys some fish, and the guy wraps the fish up with him. You don't want to go home looking like a loser, right? So he's got to bring some fish home. So the guy wraps up the fish, and as he's leaving the store, he turns to the clerk, and he says, "Hey, buddy, would you mind tossing these fish to me so I can honestly say that I caught them? I don't like to lie on Sundays, So, that kind of explains, that communicates, like the fourth commandment, we wonder, how can we, what do we do with it? It makes us say and do odd things at times, and people have done this all throughout history. We end up feeling guilty because we don't know exactly what it means or if we're doing it right. What can we do? What can't we do? What day of the week is it? Or to put it another way, perhaps we know pretty much what it means, but we don't know how it applies to our lives today in 2022. And that's because there are at least three issues that you have to consider when you begin to study the fourth commandment. And these are difficulties that we have to account for. You can't ignore this when you're beginning to look at this commandment. As we begin, it helps us to acknowledge these three difficulties. So I'm going to present them up front, and then we'll address them. These difficulties are not equal in importance, and I didn't write them down because one is more important than the other. They're just difficult things that we have to kind of try to understand. But taken together, they show us the difficulties that we face in trying to live out the proper interpretation of how this commandment applies to us. First of all, you need to know this. This is the only commandment that is not specifically repeated in the New Testament. I think that's significant. or at least it could be significant. You need to consider that the other 9 commandments are specifically referenced or repeated in one way or another in the New Testament. But this one, not really sure. I mean, therefore, what we know is that 9 of the 10 commandments are still in effect because Jesus talked about them, or they're still in force because the apostles taught them, and they're specifically repeated in the New Testament. But what about this one? Why wasn't this one repeated or endorsed or talked about? What does that suggest to us? That's kind of what the debate is all about. Second thing you need to consider is that the New Testament church, we know, has historically, after the first couple of hundred years anyways, began to worship on Sunday. While there have been few exceptions to this, and people have done it on various days, the vast majority of Christians in the world today have historically worshiped on Sundays. We call Sunday the Sabbath day. As a result of that, many people automatically assume that Christians observing worship on Sunday equals the Old Testament observance of the Sabbath. But is that really true? I mean, that's our assumption, isn't it? That's kind of what we believe. And the third thing we have to actually look at is, and I don't like this, and you might not like this either, but this is true, we face a fading tradition of Sunday as a holy or sacred day in our culture. People don't look at it like that anymore. Now, we're free to debate the reasons for why this is, but you can't really debate that this is true. Sunday is not a very special day in most people's hearts here in America. It's really not. Strict Sunday observances of services is a fading tradition in America. And I don't like that, but that's just the way it is. One writer I read put it like this. He says, our great-grandparents called Sunday the Holy Sabbath Day. Our grandparents called it Sabbath Day. Our parents called it Sunday, and now it's just called the last day of the weekend, because over time it's lost its meaning. And let's just be honest, many people today think nothing of skipping a church service every now and again on the weekend if something better comes up. I mean, look, tickets to a game, a chance to spend the weekend at the beach. I love the beach. Go to the mountains, go to the golf course or fishing, or the Super Bowl. I mean, come on, Robert, it's only once a year. Isn't that a special? Can't we just take that day off? It's not that big a deal, is it? Our problem is not that we go out and have fun on Sundays. I'm not saying that. Our problem is that it really doesn't even bother us when we skip church anymore. And I know I'm preaching to the choir. You guys are all here. Thank you for being here. But this is true. If something comes up, it doesn't bother us if we miss a Sunday. And then it bothers us because it doesn't bother us. And we think maybe somehow we're disappointing God. And then being modern people, we go ahead and enjoy our Sunday anyways, and then we feel guilty. So what is the big deal? What is this all about? No wonder we're all mixed up. Today we're going to look at this commandment and try to figure out how it actually applies to you and me in our day and age right now as people. We're going to look at the Sabbath Principle, why it was set up, why it actually is a thing, the Sabbath Law, because it was given as a law. What is that and who does that apply to? And then the Sabbath Blessing, because there's a blessing that comes with observing the Sabbath. God's promised rest, and it's very, very important. So we're going to start with the Sabbath Principle. And there is a Sabbath Principle that was established long before it became a Sabbath law. The Ten Commandments are actually delivered in 2 different places in the Old Testament. You guys realize, and when you look at them, sometimes one's in a little different order, and one, the words actually change. And the first time that the Ten Commandments is given is where we've been studying it. It's in Exodus chapter 20. And this list of commandments represents God's original delivery of what we call the Ten Commandments. And he delivered it to the Hebrew nation. Keep in mind that this occurred just a few months after God had brought the people out of Egypt. You all saw the movie, right? And it parted the Red Sea, and they walked through the Red Sea, and he brought them to the foot of Mount Sinai, and that's all detailed in Exodus. The second time that God delivers the Ten Commandments is in Deuteronomy. And this is actually the second time that God's delivering the Ten Commandments. His second delivery is given to what he calls the nation of Israel, these people that he's called. And the second listing in Deuteronomy was given about 40 years after he had delivered them out of Egypt. If you remember, they wandered around in the desert for like 40 years, right? And it was given to this new generation of people who are going to be heading into the promised land. And this was God's way of just reestablishing these commandments. The second list represents this new generation that God was talking to, and so it changes just a little bit. But let's first look in Exodus, because that's what we've been studying all of these in, and I didn't want to jump around. In Exodus chapter 20, this is what God spoke and wrote on the tablets with his finger, if you remember. He says, "Remember to observe the Sabbath day by keeping it holy." Doesn't exactly explain how we keep a day holy, but we're going to keep it holy by observing the Sabbath. You have 6 days each week to work for your ordinary work, but on the seventh day, God says that is the Sabbath day of rest, dedicated to the Lord your God. On that day, no one in your household may do any work. And then he goes on to specify it. He says that includes you, your sons, your daughters, your male and female servants, your livestock, even your animals. How about that? And even foreigners that are living among you or in your house. For in 6 days the Lord made heaven and earth and the sea and everything in them. But on the seventh day he rested. And notice this part. He said, that is why the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and set it apart as holy. The Hebrew word there, to remember the Sabbath, that word remember, it means more than just recalling something. It's more than just, I need to remember to pick up milk on the way home, or, I need to remember, to do this or do that. What it really means, that word to remember in Hebrew actually means to commemorate. It's hold it as special, much like we remember our wedding anniversary or a birthday, a child's birthday, and we celebrate that by throwing a big party. To commemorate the Sabbath was for the purpose of keeping the Sabbath holy. Remembering it and commemorating it was keeping it holy. That is it was set apart. It was a day for God. And look, that's exactly how they understood it. When God delivered this commandment to them, they knew exactly what he was talking about. And here we clearly see that God actually wants us to work. Work is not a bad thing. You may hate your job, but work is not a bad thing. It isn't bad. It isn't evil. Since we bear the image of God and we create things, we pursue things, our work is noble and even godly. It's a part of our existence. God wants us all to be active in working. God wants us to work, to use our energy and our creativity to achieve something. You are doing what God created you to do. That is really, really important. But on the seventh day, which was Saturday to these people, God commands Israel to stop working. In fact, the word Sabbath comes from the root word stop. It means to stop or cease. The idea here is that it's an interruption of what is normal, and normal is working on the other 6 days. And just to make sure Israel gets it, God then lists it all out. Everyone's to stop working, right? The children, the servants, the livestock, even non-Jewish guests that are living with these people in this community. In fact, the entire Jewish economy came to a grinding halt on Saturdays, on the Sabbath day. Now, if you look at the first 3 of the 10 commandments, I don't know if you noticed this, but they focus strictly on you and your relationship with God. They're about how you worship God, right? Worship the one true God. Accept no imitation gods in your life. It's all about you and God. Take God seriously. We talked about that last week. The last 6 commandments we're going to see are going to focus exclusively on our love and our relationships with other people. They're about us and other people. But this command is kind of it's a changing place. It's a hinge, if you will, of both the vertical dimension between us and God and the horizontal relationships between us and other people. On the one hand, it's a Sabbath to the Lord or for the Lord, which means it's a Sabbath for worship. It's a time to set aside to worship God and to worship him corporately and together as people, as a congregation. This is how it's been understood for thousands of years. But on the other hand, it's also a Sabbath for the community, for us and our families and as people. Everyone equally gets rest from their labor, rich and poor alike. It doesn't matter who you are, you need to rest. You need to slow down. You can't work every single day. You'll work yourself to death. But the reason God gives in Exodus for this commandment, and this might shock you, but it's very different from the reason that we actually see for it in Deuteronomy. And I'm going to show you in a few minutes. This commandment actually, I would say it evolves over time. It changes slightly, and it's the only one that does. It's the only one that does, but it does change, and you're going to see that's indisputable. Here in Exodus, the reason God gives us these instructions is because God created the universe in 7 days, and then he rested, or 6 days, and then he rested on the seventh day. That's exactly what it says. God's creation of the universe was the original basis for Israel's observance of this fourth commandment, Sabbath. Because God observed the Sabbath on the seventh day, and he says, you should too. Israel is now to follow suit and observe the Sabbath on the seventh day. Now, of course, God resting on the seventh day doesn't mean that God was actually tired. I mean, we may be tired. You work 6 days in a row. On the seventh day, you may be tired. But it is a way of God saying that he had finished his creation and he stopped. And he stopped. And when God rested on the seventh day, that was God's way of saying, I'm done. It's finished. I've created what I set out to make, and there's no need to work to make anything else. And the moment that God rested on that seventh day, back in Genesis, he established what is called the Sabbath Principle. And he declared that all of our time doesn't just belong to us, but some of our time belongs to God. Some of your time and some of my time actually belongs to God. Now, this raises a question. When exactly did people start observing the Sabbath? We know that God himself observed it back at creation because he says he did. He rested on the seventh day. We're told that untold numbers of thousands of years ago, God created the universe in 6 days, and on the seventh day he rested. But interestingly, there's nothing that you can find in the Old Testament that specifically tells us, for example, that Adam and Eve observed the Sabbath. It doesn't say, it just doesn't mention it. That doesn't mean it didn't happen, but Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, did they observe the Sabbath? I don't know. Nothing tells us they did. It doesn't tell us they didn't. I mean, you can look it up, but it's not in there. It's just not mentioned. The very first time the Bible even mentions people observing a Sabbath is here in Exodus, when God takes that Sabbath principle and makes it a law. And it occurs after God had delivered Israel out of Egypt. So the fourth commandment now becomes a law. The Sabbath principle becomes a law based on something uniquely given to Israel at that time and for a certain reason. Even though God himself set aside the seventh day as holy during creation, God didn't command anyone to observe the seventh day as a Sabbath until right here. This is the first time this comes up as a law. And in this fourth commandment, this reference to the seventh day of creation, we find this principle. That's why it was called a principle before it became a law. This Sabbath principle doesn't become law until God gives the nation of Israel these 10 commandments at the foot of Mount Sinai in Exodus 20. So what is the Sabbath principle that I keep talking about? It is this, and this is an undisputable fact, that God created this world and this universe to kind of, there was a rhythm. There's a rhythm to life. And I'll show you, you guys all kind of know this, but there's a rhythm for renewal and rest and activity, and that we should honor and remember God and see him in all of this renewal. The Sabbath principle is the fact that God built into creation, right into creation, a rhythm of working and resting. And I find it fascinating that in almost every culture, you will find that 7 is considered to be the number of completion or a sacred number. It indicates completeness or fullness. And I think the universal acceptance of this number is a remnant of the traces of God in all of creation. We see this rhythm of renewal. Let me explain it to you like this. We see this renewal. We're in winter right now. All the leaves have fallen off the trees, and it looks like everything is dead. My lawn is brown, and so is yours. And it looks like it's dead, but it's not. We all know that it's spring. It's going to come back, right? And we see the changing of the seasons, and we see that it does it regularly as the earth rotates around the sun. These things, the tipping of the axis, we have seasons, and we look forward to those seasons. We look forward to the renewal in spring and summer and fall and then winter. And this happens every single year. There is a rhythm to life within the universe. The structure of the universe shows that there is this rhythm, a constant rhythm of things moving and circling and orbiting. We honor that rhythm when we function in harmony with that rhythm. And it's a rhythm that God has established. However, when we refuse to honor that rhythm and we find ourselves in conflict with like this rhythm of renewal and rest and awake time and a rest and awake time. Taking time to worship God with other believers, therefore, reminds us that we have a relationship not just with other people, but we have a relationship with God. And there's a rhythm to that worship. Ceasing from our labor is a way of acknowledging that some of our lives belongs to God. It is a way of saying, God, I won't forget you. I won't get so busy in my activity that I will forget about you. Although my work is important, it doesn't define who I am. This rhythm of life needs to be observed. And it takes faith to honor the Sabbath principle. Faith that some of our time actually belongs to God, that we are responsible to God with part of our life. It's important that we do that. This rhythm of renewal is it's like the regular maintenance on your car. If you take your car and you have the oils changed and you get tires and you rotate your tires, you replace worn out parts, the car can last you a long time. If you ignore the preventive maintenance on your car is going to fall apart. Our lives have kind of a maintenance schedule too. And it's important. If you've ever tried to ignore your rest cycle and you go days and days and days without getting proper rest, what happens? Well, you begin to fall apart, right? There's a rhythm to life. And God actually built that into the universe. And when we fail to honor the rhythm of life, we begin to break down. Our lives, our relationships will begin to break down. It might be an emotional breakdown or a relational breakdown, or it might even be a spiritual breakdown. Ignore God and your life will begin to devolve, right? Without respecting this rhythm of renewal, our lives will break down. It's just a matter of time. So let me suggest a few practical ways that you can respect and practice the Sabbath principle. We know that you need to have some rest. You can't work 7 days a week. You'll end up falling apart. And so you should have at least a day where you are not working, and you can kind of review your week and reflect on that with time for your family and time for God. You need to work this into your schedule. It's important that you do this. That means breaking from your regular routine at some point during the week to recharge your batteries, to just get a sense of where you are. And it needs to be done often. Reconnecting in your relationships with people and with God. If you don't, it's like ignoring the low oil light on your car. You're in for some bad times, right? Secondly, I think it's important that you take at least one day a month and you begin to reflect on what your month has been and what's coming ahead, and you kind of get a sense of where you are and where you're going. If you begin to do this, your life will make much more sense and you'll feel much more in control. So take time to reflect about your life monthly. Look at your priorities, because your priorities begin to change and they can get out of control very, very quickly. And so you seek guidance and wisdom from God, and you just look at your month and you figure out what you've been doing. And honestly, you can do this on a Saturday in the mountains, or, a Wednesday down at the beach. It doesn't have to be a specific day, but you shouldn't forget to actually evaluate time as it goes by in your life. Also, you can do this on a yearly basis. Look at your year in review. I do this. Sometimes I'm happy with my year in review. Sometimes I'm not so happy. But it helps me kind of correct my course. It's like looking at a compass and making sure that you're still headed in the right direction. You evaluate your priorities and your prayer time and your life's direction, where you are and where you want to be. These are some practical suggestions. These are not biblical suggestions. To me, these are practical suggestions on how to respect the rhythm of renewal, or the Sabbath principle. But then there's also the Sabbath law, and this is undisputable. This Sabbath principle that God dictated in Genesis, that he kind of spoke into the universe, becomes a law. The moment that God gave the fourth commandment to the nation of Israel, this principle now became a law. And if you read it in Deuteronomy, I read it to you in Exodus. Now I'm going to read it to you in Deuteronomy. This is where the people are getting ready to go into the promised land. Notice this. This is how it reads. Observe the Sabbath day by keeping it holy, as the Lord your God has commanded you. You have 6 days each week for your ordinary work, but on the seventh day, that's the Sabbath day of rest dedicated to the Lord your God. On that day, no one in your household is to do any work. That includes you, your son, your daughter, your male, female servants, your oxen, your donkeys, your livestock, all the foreigners living among you. All the male and female servants must rest as you do. So far, so good, right? Anybody notice any differences there? Not really. It's basically the exact same thing, right? It's a repeat of what he said in Exodus, but also notice this. Remember that you were once slaves in Egypt, but the Lord your God brought you out with a strong hand and powerful arm. That is why the Lord your God has commanded you to rest on the Sabbath day. Notice here that the essence of the commandment is the same, but did you notice how it shifted just a little bit? The reason for observing the Sabbath is actually different here. It reads a little bit differently. That's why I said it evolves or it changes, because it does. It's obvious. The original reason, that is why, was for the observance in obedience to God's creation that God had created in 6 days, and then he rested on the seventh. But now we find that their obedience to this is connected to God's deliverance of them out of Egypt. God's kind of updating it for these people to understand this isn't a contradiction. It's not that one contradicts the other. It doesn't contradict what God said back in Exodus, but it builds upon it, because God's relationship with these people has changed over time. And so he's kind of spelling it out there. Understand, if you want to be technical about it, when God gave Israel their Sabbath law, it actually included a lot more than just 1 day a week to worship God and rest, and that it has to happen on Saturday. The weekly observance of the Sabbath was the foundation where people were supposed to stop and rest, and that's part of the renewal process. And it was 1 day a week. But it also included other Sabbaths. You know, there are other Sabbath laws that people observed for thousands of years. There were monthly Sabbaths that the people would observe. Each month, they call it a new moon celebration. It was a Sabbath. Every month there was a Sabbath. They would celebrate the new moon by offering a grain offering to God, and that was considered to be a Sabbath. There were other Sabbath laws, too, that included seasonal Sabbath festivals. Many of them you may have heard over. Passover, you may have heard about Passover, the Feast of Weeks, the Feast of Booths, all these different things. These were yearly that they would observe these feasts and festivals. Some of them lasted days, some of them lasted weeks, but they were considered a Sabbath celebration. People would travel to Jerusalem from all over the country to be there for that special week during the year when they would have these seasonal or yearly Sabbaths. Israel's Sabbath laws also included something called a Sabbatical Year, or Sabbath year. Every seventh year, this is amazing, the land was supposed to rest. And in agriculture, we still follow resting for the land and that kind of thing. But no farming was allowed at this time. And people who owed debts, they were in debt, they were forgiven those loans every 7 years. That was supposed to happen every seventh year, that all debts are forgiven. I keep trying to persuade my credit card companies to observe this on religious basis, but no dice so far. I'm going to keep trying, though. Finally, Israel's Sabbath law also included a year of Jubilee, which happened every 50 years, and it was considered a Sabbath. During the year of Jubilee, slaves were released, and the land went back to its original owners, and these were all Sabbath laws. My reason for telling you about all these Sabbaths is simply to show you that these were traditionally included under the fourth commandment. It wasn't just about 1 day. There were, and I'll show you here scripturally too. So if the fourth commandment applies to us today in the same way that it applied to Israel, if we're going to say, well, they did it in the Old Testament, so we need to do it today, shouldn't we also observe more than just the weekly Sabbath? Shouldn't we observe all those other Sabbaths as well? Wouldn't we, if it's still binding, shouldn't all those other Sabbaths be binding to us as well? Monthly, seasonal, yearly, every 50 years, the year of Jubilee. I mean, if we're going to be consistent, shouldn't we celebrate those too? And some people do. I have a good friend, and I worshiped with him years ago, and he has kind of moved away from just strict Christian faith. He's become what he calls a Messianic Jew. And I don't know if you've ever heard of Messianic Judaism. Messianic Judaism is a practice by people that believe Christ was the Messiah. They totally believe that Christ was the Messiah, but they still continue to practice the Old Testament traditions. They still continue to act like they are Jews, even though they believe Jesus is the Christ. Makes no sense to me. But, free will is free will, and as long as you love Jesus, I'm okay. We agree on the most important issues. But the deal is, the Bible says that these Sabbath laws were a unique sign between God and his covenant with the nation of Israel. God made a covenant with the nation of Israel. In Exodus chapter 31, God even says, you must observe my Sabbaths. Notice plural there. You must observe my Sabbaths. This will be a sign. He's talking to Israel. This will be a sign between me and you for generations to come, so that you may know that I am the Lord who makes you holy. Ezekiel chapter 20 even expounds on this point. It says, I gave them my Sabbaths. Notice, again, plural. As a sign between us, so they would know that I, the Lord God, made them holy. So what is the purpose of this Sabbath law? God gave Israel the Sabbath laws to signify their special relationship with him. That's why he did it, along with circumcision, along with certain dietary restrictions. It was like a wedding ring with Israel. These all symbolize that God and Israel had a special relationship. That's why we call it the Mosaic Covenant, because this is a covenant between God and the people that Moses brought out of Egypt. And God established a special relationship with them through Moses, because the Sabbath laws were assigned to Israel. And because of that, we need to be very careful about how we apply those Sabbath laws or those Mosaic laws to our own lives. According to the Bible, I can say as a Christian, I'm not bound to live by the Mosaic Covenant, most of it. I'm not bound by the laws of the Old Testament, because Jesus created a new covenant. He even said it. I came to bring a new covenant. This new covenant differs from the Mosaic Covenant in some very significant ways. And what happens is Christian, just like my friend who's a Messianic Jew, so he believes in Christ, but he wants to be a Jew, so he still follows all of the laws. A lot of Christians, we want to follow Christ. It's a new covenant, but we want to practice some Old Testament things as well, and it gets very, very confusing. And just arbitrarily applying parts of the Mosaic Covenant to our lives would be like finding your great aunt's wedding license, whiting out her name and putting your name on there. I mean, it wasn't always a contract with everybody. It wasn't a covenant with God gave the Sabbath law specifically to the nation of Israel to signify their special relationship with him. Now, does that mean that none of it applies to us? No, I'm not saying that at all. But as we move forward, let's also look at what is called the Sabbath Blessing. There is a blessing that comes with observing the Sabbath. And so to say that this doesn't apply at all would be incorrect. The New Testament describes a Sabbath blessing that comes to the people through, not surprisingly, Jesus himself. What is the Sabbath blessing, and how is that different than the Sabbath principle or the Sabbath law? If you remember, the religious leaders in Jesus' day didn't like Jesus very much because he was changing their traditions. He didn't hold fast to all of their Old Testament traditions, and the religious leaders of Jesus' day often accused him of breaking some of the Mosaic law, and especially the fourth commandment. And really, it's almost like he did it on purpose. I mean, because he did it over and over and over again. On one occasion, Jesus and his disciples are walking through the fields, and there's obviously some Pharisees there with them. And they begin to they rub some of the grains off the heads of the stalks there, and they begin to eat them. A little snack on some wheat or whatever. And the religious leaders, they had these strict guidelines. And these strict guidelines said you couldn't do any work on the Sabbath, no labor whatsoever. And apparently rubbing the head of wheat grain is labor. And so they accused Jesus that he had broke the fourth commandment. In fact, they came up with 39 different activities that you specifically could not do on the Sabbath. You couldn't do all these kinds of things. And I don't have time to go over all of them, but they were just kind of crazy. So the religious leaders, they accused Jesus of breaking the fourth commandment. In Mark chapter 2, here's exactly what Jesus said. They said, hey, you're breaking the fourth commandment. And he said, the Son of Man is Lord even over the Sabbath. The title Son of Man is an Old Testament reference to the book of Daniel, and it described who the Messiah was, what the Messiah would be all about, that he was a king and he was the Lord of Israel. And so by using this title, the Son of Man, referring to himself, Jesus is proclaiming his right to define how this fourth commandment actually applies to him. And as the Lord, he's saying here, I have authority over even these Sabbath laws. When Jesus was breaking, was their traditions, not really the law, though. And so here we find that Jesus has the authority. It's undisputable. Jesus has the authority to define how and when the fourth commandment actually applies any way that he wants to. Now, many early Jewish Christians, you might not know this, but Jewish Christians didn't automatically start worshiping on Sunday. They worshiped on Saturday because these were Jewish people who had grown up in a tradition that Saturday was the day that you go to church. And so many Jewish Christians continued to meet on Saturdays, and that's a fact. They did it for hundreds of years. But over the years, most non-Jewish Christians eventually began to worship on Sunday. And that was to commemorate Jesus' resurrection. They said, you know what? It's better to worship on Sunday, the day Jesus rose from the dead, than Saturday. And so there's no mistake here. This was a huge area of tension between Jewish Christians and non-Jewish Christians. And so some people would say, well, if you're going to worship God, you have to do it on this specific day. And some of the people said, no, we're going to do it on this day. So the Apostle Paul actually addresses this in Colossians. And we're going to talk about this Wednesday. But he said this. He said, don't let anyone condemn you. Here's the scripture. It's in your notes too. Don't let anyone condemn you for what you eat or drink, or for not celebrating certain holy days, or new moon ceremonies, or Sabbaths. For these rules are only shadows of the reality that is yet to come. And Christ himself is that reality. Now, the eating and drinking here represents the Jewish dietary laws. Is there anybody in here that follows Jewish dietary laws, by the way? Anybody? No, me either, right? Most Jewish Christians continue to respect at this time. They continue to respect their Old Testament dietary restrictions because they've been living with it all their life. While most non-Jewish Christians at the time were able to eat bacon. Praise God in heaven. And we get to too, right? Because we're not subject to those dietary laws. The religious festivals that he's talking about, here's the Jewish festivals of Passover and all those different things, the Feast of Weeks and that stuff, the Feast of Unleavened Bread. I mean, they had a lot of these things. The new moon celebrations that Paul's referring here to is those monthly Sabbaths that we talked about, required by God in the Old Testament. And finally, the Sabbath day was the weekly Sabbath that he's talking about that. So what Paul is saying here is that these laws, these food purity laws and these Sabbath laws, all this stuff, it was only a shadow. They were only teaching you something that is to come. In the Old Testament is a lot of this. In the Old Testament, they were pointing towards Jesus as the Messiah. And Paul says these laws, these food purity laws, these Sabbath laws, they are just a shadow looking forward to the Messiah. Paul's not against people observing these laws if they want to, but he's saying they're not binding to everybody, and you shouldn't feel condemned. You shouldn't feel pressured because some people do and you don't. And as the Messiah, Jesus fulfilled all of these Sabbath laws. He fulfilled the entire law, if you remember. Jesus fulfilled every part of the Old Testament law, and they were fulfilled by him. And so the ceremonial shadows and laws were just part of what Paul was talking about here, the coming Messiah. The arrival of the Messiah actually marked the end of God's requirements for a lot of the laws that were in the Old Testament. Just like it marked the end of the food laws and the circumcision law. We don't have to do that. A lot of stuff that they did in the Old Testament, we don't have to do because we're not under the law, we're under grace. It's a new covenant. Even as Christians began to generally move from Saturday to Sunday for worship, most Christians that you know and I know, we still worship on Sunday. But a lot of people think that it's because it's required by the law. But is that true? Truth is, although Sunday was a natural day to gather and worship, there was a lot of flexibility. In the early church, there was a lot of flexibility on when you would worship, and a lot of it had to do with their work schedules as well. It wasn't until 321 AD when the Roman Emperor Constantine proclaimed that Sunday was now the national day of rest, that everyone was to take it off. Basically, he started the whole "we're closed on Sunday" thing, and he made a connection. People began to make a connection between that day of rest and the Old Testament Sabbath day of rest. One Bible historian says it like this: as we survey the church history, we see that for centuries, there was no indication that Sunday was to be observed on the basis of the fourth commandment. That's not really why we switched to Sundays. We really switched to Sundays because Constantine did for the church, and it was the Catholic Church, and they started. So every church now worships on Sunday pretty much. The Sabbath law, like all Jewish laws, find their complete fulfillment in who Jesus is, not on us following the law. However, the author of Hebrews presents us with another way of looking at the Sabbath, and I love this so much. It's really, really important. In Hebrews chapter 4, you'll find this verse. It says, so there's a special rest, exact same word that's used, talking about Sabbath, special rest still waiting for the people of God. For all who have entered into God's rest, rested from their labors, just as God did after creating the new world. So this is a reference to God's creation back in Genesis. So let us do our best to enter that rest. But if we disobey God, as the people of Israel did, then we will fall. Here what we see is that God has a very special rest for us. And it doesn't mean just like lounging around or whatever, and it started a long, long time ago. It started as a great principle, then it became a law, and now it becomes a blessing. Although the Old Testament Sabbath laws pointed towards that rest, these laws were inadequate, just like all the other laws. You couldn't work your way to God. There had to be a better way, and so Jesus made that way. Although Sabbath's rest might give you some rest, but the real rest, a way of getting into God's eternal rest, kind of like God's rest is experienced best and really through Jesus Christ, and that changes our eternity. And it's only for those who enter and we have faith in Jesus when we cease working our way towards God and accept that Christ did it for us. We no longer have to work our way or behave our way or perform our way into good graces with God. Jesus was enough, and he made that way possible. This presents Jesus himself as this eternal Sabbath rest. And we enter into that rest by ceasing from our efforts to try to please God on our behavior or our performance or our ability to follow the law. That grace is brought about by Jesus only and his sacrifice, that he made our relationship with God now possible. And here we find that Jesus really only offers the real rest. When Jesus said, come to me, all you who are weary, and you will find rest. You will find rest for your souls. We can't perform our way into God's good graces. This is what Jesus meant when he said, come to me, all you who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest. You can rest. We sang that song, Blessed Assurance. We have a blessed assurance because of what Christ did, not because we keep certain laws or don't keep certain laws. That doesn't disqualify us. We shouldn't feel, Paul says, don't feel condemned that you don't do this or you don't do that. So what is this Sabbath blessing? Through Jesus Christ, God offers us an eternity of rested security, that we are secure with God regardless of the Old Testament laws. The Sabbath principle is still good. You should still get rest. You should still take a day to set aside and evaluate your life, your relationship with God, your relationship with other people. That's great stuff. It only makes sense to do that because God created the universe with a rhythm. And if you don't observe that rhythm, your relationship with God, your relationship with people is going to be horrible. So God has set up the universe in a way that we can do that. There is a Sabbath law that is unique to the nation of Israel. I would tell you the Sabbath law in the Old Testament, it meant something for them. But there is a Sabbath blessing to everyone who comes to the saving knowledge of Jesus Christ. The bottom line is, the fourth commandment, you need to understand it, is this. Life is meant to be lived in relationship with God. It's of primary importance that is the case. Your relationship with God is important. And your relationship with God should include regular worship, where you pause from your daily activities and you come and you worship God, and there's a time of refreshment. You also need to take time for your other relationships as well. You can't simply spend your life working endlessly. And people have done this, and they work year after year after year, and they realize that at the end of it, they have a bunch of stuff, but they have no relationships. And that's where they end up. And since this law was fulfilled by Christ, we now have the liberty to apply this principle to our lives individually. And how we go about doing that is between us and between God. But it all starts by entering into the Sabbath blessing through faith in Jesus Christ. One of the things that we do here at church every week is to have a time set aside where we can pray for you. If you're in a point in your life where